Welcome to Pier-Glass Poetry Panels. I'm Stan Galloway, your host, and today's panel is entitled Breaking the Line in Poetry. We'll be hearing from poets in the U.S. and Peru. If you're joining us live, we ask you not to use the chat function, but instead send your questions and comments through the Q&A box at our website, pierglasspoetry.wixsite.com/mysite. We'll take a look at those toward the end of the show. But now, to get us started, let's meet our first poet. Coming to us today from Peru, Tacey M. Atsitty, Dene, Navajo, is Sleep Rock people and born for Tangle people. She grew up in Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. Atsitty is a recipient of the Truman Capote Creative Writing Fellowship, Morningstar Creative Writing Award, and others. She holds degrees from Brigham Young University, the Institute of American Indian Arts, and Cornell University. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in such venues as Poetry, Epic, Kenyon Review Online, Prairie Schooner, and When the Light of Our World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, a Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry. Her first book is Rain Scald, University of New Mexico Press, 2018. She's the director of the Navajo Film Festival, the poetry judge for Eggtooth Edition's chapbook contest, and a creative writing PhD student at Florida State University. We're happy to have you here, Tacey.
Hi, thank you, Stan. Thank you for having me. I kind of feel like my dad was a bull rider, and so I feel like I'm like sitting on the bull ready to go out of the chute. It's like, anyway, I don't know why I was thinking that just now. But yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Oh, yeah, we're so glad to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
She Sani Edel Enedashijine, Senna Habitlin, Khatna Sani Bashichin, Kabaheda Shichero Hashkan Hazada Chanale, Akot Al Dene Astanishla. So, like Stan said, my name is Tacey Atsitty. I'm Sleep Rock people, born for the Tangle people. My maternal grandfather is Water Edge people, and my paternal grandfather is Yucca Fruit, strung out in a line people. This is how I am a Dene, or a Navajo woman. It's how I'm taught to introduce myself to a new group of people so that you know who I am and where I come from. So I just want to recognize the land that I'm on right now. I'm in Lima, Peru, and the land of my husband. He's from Venezuela and from Iquitos, Peru. And so he comes from Incan and Amazonian descent and from Venezuela. So today, I'm excited to join the panel about talking about line breaks.
Well, and that's exactly the question that we're exploring today. And so you get to start us off. You know, as a poet, what is it that determines where a line begins and ends?
Yeah, so because the panel title was line breaks, I think a lot about in my own work, right? Where does the line break? How do I break it? And thinking back on the years of study under my professors and things that I've learned about other people's work. I feel like for me, I always try to make it fresh. I try to, I write a lot in form. And so I'm really kind of captivated by the sonnets recently, these past several years, and so I've been writing quite a few sonnets, and being able to write in form and structure, and thinking about the rhyme schemes and the end rhymes, and making sure that those aren't too loud. All of those things kind of I juggle in my head as I'm working with the structures. And so I'm actually going to share screen right now, if that's okay. Talking a little bit about the line breaks and just do a brief overview. I know that there's some Ron and Lesley they'll probably go further into depth about what I'm going to talk a little bit about in breaking the line here in poetry. Can everyone see my screen? Just want to make sure. Okay, I'm guessing you can. Okay, so Just some definitions about the line break. Oxford Languages says that a line break is the point at which two lines of text are split. The end of a line, in the Poetry Foundation says that it's the running over of a sentence or phrase from one poetic line to the next without terminal punctuation, the opposite of end stop. And I'll talk about that here in a second. And I kind of am basing a lot of these slides today in the presentation off of two articles that I found. One by, I can't remember her name, Hannah Huff, and another by David Schultz, and them talking about the line break. And so this is what Hannah Huff says about the line versus the sentence. Remember, there's a difference between a line and a sentence. A sentence is the grade school tool that expresses a complete thought. A line is the literal linear streak of text flowing across the page. A line is a container for sentences. A line is a boa constrictor stretched across a paper road, and a sentence is a still whole squirrel in its belly. Kind of sounds like a poem right there. And then this is taken from an article from the Poetry Foundation, and it's in my works. I can't remember her name. But she says that poetry is the sound of organized language, the sound of language organized by lines. Critic and poet James Longenbach, in his preface to The Art of Poetic Line, also links the definition of poetry to lineation. Poetry is the sound of language organized in lines. But the line can be difficult to talk about because it doesn't operate independently of other poetic elements, as sense, syntax, sound, and rhythm can. Instead, it is a modifier and amplifier of sense, syntax, sound, and rhythm, which is precisely why an exploration of line can illuminate poetry as a whole. And so I feel like for that reason, when considering in my own work the end of a line, and of course the beginning of a line in that same breath, you have to consider all of these things, right? Like I said earlier, I often write in form, and so I'm thinking somewhat about scansion. I'm thinking about the rhyme scheme. I'm thinking about visually, what does it look like on the page? And so you're considering diction, you're considering rhythm and all of that. Okay. So the end stop versus enjambment within the line. End stops is just another word for a period. A period is just a little black dot that indicates that the sentence is complete. If we end at such an obvious end, our poetry becomes predictable. And this is a no-no because poetry's greatest offering is linguistic eurekas. Yeah, and it says there, it becomes kind of boring, right? Predictable. Enjambment births sentence fragments, multi-dimensional meaning, and visual appeal through the unexpected intrusion of white space. And I have a question later on that I'll consider with that, with the page and what it looks like when we talk about enjambment. Enjambment is the point where a sentence fissures and continues on to the next poetic line. And so David Schultz writes a little bit about these classifying the line breaks, looking at how we break up the sentence or the phrase or the clause. So here's just a couple of examples where he talks about the break types and then the examples here. And considering all of these aligned with sentence, with phrase, within clause, morphemes, and at the letters. I feel like we get kind of maybe down to like Aram, Sarayan, and BP Nickel down here. Okay, so do's. So these are do's, that's not dos. Do's when thinking about your line breaks, considering the visual structure. Always something to consider. What does the text look like on the page? What does the black look like on the page? How is it how is it moving? How does it look on the page? Not only that, looking at the entire text, but also looking at the meaning, the significance of your end word, and how does it resonate into that white void of the page. Because in a sense, to me, I feel like there's this, it's an opening, right? It's kind of like the end of a poem. You want to finish, or at least I like to finish where it's not something that's neatly tied up and wrapped with a bow, but it opens up a possibility. And so each line break, you have that same opportunity to kind of open up the poem in a way on the page. So how does it resonate into that white void of the page, into that opening, into that silence? Keep in mind your diction, looking for moments where a word can be used doubly as a noun or a verb, and or words that introduce additional meanings. Are you using form with a formal scansion and rhyme scheme? How can you keep your end words fresh visually and make sure that your rhymes are not coming in too loud? And one of the ways that I like to make sure that I don't have those end rhymes so loud is I like to input internal rhymes. And sometimes it's become so subconscious, but yeah, that's one of the ways around that for me. And then also, if you are working with a form, how can you keep your end words like fresh, like I said, and not feel too constricted with the form? There's quite a few don'ts, and these come from Hannah Huff also. And I'm sure you can, break some of these, but never end a poetic line on an article. Never end a poetic line on a conjunction. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I do like and, right? Because I don't like to start a sentence with and. I don't like to start, a line with and. Let's see, never end a poetic line on a pronoun. Try really hard not to end a poetic line on a preposition. Line breaks on unusual nouns and verbs that ring strong as standalone words. However, be aware that the enjambment can rejuvenate common tired words, light home breath, and so on, like no other poetic device. Line break at a rhythmic point to poise meaning and weave a sonic tapestry. And I always say you get to the point where you just start going with your gut. Okay, and then I have a poem here about gut, kind of. So I'm going to just take a minute to read. This is one of my poems published in Crazy Horse a few years back. Sonnet for my wrist. I tend to mistake your ribs for a hand towel. It hangs on a nail above the wash bowl, the hand towel ripped. There's something wearing about the end curve of thread. When I sleep, I keep my palms open. Verve. We were lovers in a field of gray. In Navajo, we say something wrote. I'll radical when you hurt me something close. Even you waft, it's best I tether, forget flyaways I plucked. My bones, they lie to me like fray, like gaunt. I don't crawl back for fragments. Even a spinal cord of sinew. It's not going to close. You rope me from stray to grip. It's all for naught. I'm born for my father. Tangle people, our mouths in webs. Tonight, my wrists part, and you chase my insides until they dangle into pieces. So here, some of the uses that I employ, I'll talk a little bit about the poetic line. Some of these lines contain a complete sentence. I tend to mistake your ribs for a hand towel, right? A poetic line can also contain multiple sentences. And let's see, I plucked my bones, they lay to me like freight, right? And then you also have poetic line containing sentence with incomplete sentences, or multiple sentences with incomplete sentences, or just incomplete sentences here. And so some of the constrictions or the constraints that I had with, of course, writing this sonnet was the rhyme scheme. And so I used a double, well, the same word. Some people would say that it's not a rhyme, it's the same word, but towel, curve, verb, something, flyaways. And then here you can see I actually broke the rhyme scheme for the integrity of the poem. And that was something that was kind of difficult for me to step away from, because sometimes you do feel constricted within the rhyme scheme. You're like, oh, I've got to hit this rhyme, this specific rhyme. But there comes a point when you do need to break the rhyme scheme for that integrity of the poem and making sure that it continues to go forward. Okay. So you go with your gut, you go with what feels right. And so I'm going to read one more poem, and it's another sonnet, gown sonnet. Somewhere in some town, USA, there lies a bride in a trunk, in an attic, in a house, in a tangled mess of lace and limbs, a douse of clouds floating across the landscape of her eyes. Even now, her lace has begun to curl like eyelashes on a night ready for batting, and her blouse see-through as a ghost. But it wasn't that blouse she now rests in. It's a gown her mother dyed with small snakeweed in warm waters weeks before her wedding day. The bride wasn't found until years later, when a child in a veil crowned with dandelions and mums playing hide and seek broke the latch and lifted the wooden lid up, unearthing a beautiful head of hair still done up. Yeah, so here you can see enjambment, breaking up the eyelashes, doubled, her mother died, and of course that has to do with, dyeing fabric, and not an actual death, but there is death in the poem. So those are just a couple of examples, and some of the choices that I make as I consider all of the different facets of line breaks. So there's my works cited, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tacey. That was a very helpful ending that you gave, where we walked through a couple of your poems, and you looked specifically at the choices that you make, and I find it valuable, especially for beginning poets who have their intuition and say, I think this is what I want to say, but I don't know why. Sometimes being able to go back and reconstruct the why is helpful for us. And of course, the foundation that you gave us, on what a line is, was incredibly helpful. Let's move to our next poet for today. Former Poet Laureate of Virginia, Ron Smith is the author of 4 books, 3 of them from LSU Press. His most recent are The Humility of the Brutes and a second edition of his first book, Running Again in Hollywood Cemetery. The first edition of Running Again was judged by Margaret Atwood, a close runner-up for the National Poetry Series Open Competition. Smith has taught poetry and poetry writing at University of Richmond, Virginia Commonwealth University, and Mary Washington University. Currently, he is writer in residence at St. Christopher School in Richmond. We're happy you could join us today.
I'm unmuted. Hi.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Stan.
Yes.
When you suggested that we serve on a panel for line breaks, I immediately said, "What a great idea! I've never heard a panel on line breaks before." And the more I thought about it, the more I thought how hard it was to separate out line breaks from everything else in the poem. But I'll try to do that. I would begin by saying, to say beginning poets, and beginning poets and beginning readers of poetry. Although I have to say, I do think, I feel very strongly that when you read, and especially if you analyze and interpret a poem, you're using a different part of your brain altogether from the part you use when you write the poem. And they can dance together, and they have to interact from time to time, because you have to be able to read your own drafts and be able to say, you have to be able to be distant from your own work, and see what you actually put on the page rather than what you thought you put on the page, what's still in your head and not out there. But I'll approach this to begin with from the point of view of the poet, the creator. I find that, and all poets don't agree with me on this. And by the way, especially younger beginning poets and poetry lovers, remember that most poets define poetry in a self-serving way. T.S. Eliot said, "Poetry must be difficult." And he said that because he knew the poem he had in the pipeline was going to be extraordinarily difficult when it finally saw the light of day. Wordsworth said that poetry was the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. A beautiful definition of poetry, meaning his kind of poetry, but not necessarily all kinds of poetry. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, I guess, is what I would say. For me, and this is one of the things I know other poets don't always agree with, a poem is a kind of ontological mystery. It exists in two different forms. It's like, I don't know, in Christianity, the Trinity. In other words, there's the poem your eye takes in, and I'm speaking mainly of one-page lyric poems, maybe two-page poems. There's the poem your eye takes in. It's a visual experience. And then there's the poem your ear takes in, the auditory experience. And they are not the same work of art, I believe. I've more and more in my own work and in my own teaching, I've come to feel that how the poem looks on the page is extremely important. And so I will waste hundreds of hours trying to get the poem to look right rather than sound right. I may have the sound just the way I want it. Now, as I say, I can think of one really fine poet who believes, I think to this day, that poetry is the sound. It's the auditory poem that is the poem. Well, I don't think that's been true, frankly, since Gutenberg, but she works that way, and at least she says she works that way. And I want the two poems to live together. One thing I'd like to point out is that verse is not the same thing as poetry, and that verse is not the same thing as prose. Verse is the word that indicates the line, the turning of the line. You do have prose poems, and they are not verse. A prose poem is poetry, but it is not verse because it doesn't choose the line. Why I think verse that is poetry, also poetry, and I'll go into some more of that maybe. I'll probably stir up more trouble and questions than I answer here, is that as a writer of verse, you have an extra tool. You have an extra way of creating more meaning and effect. The line is a unit of meaning, and you may have a one sentence that goes for, well, in the case of A Silken Tent by Robert Frost, one sentence is 14 lines. Especially in what we call free verse, the line really does matter, because you read a line and you've got a unit of effect and meaning. And then you turn the line and you continue the sentence and you realize, oh, I was wrong. It doesn't mean that. But in fact, if it's a good poem, if you're in the hands of a trustworthy poem, it does mean that. Your mistake is not a mistake. It lingers in the mind. And I'd like to point out one of my favorite examples of this before I go any further. This is Dream Song 4. Everybody see that? You can just nod your heads. You can't see it?
No.
Oh, what happened? Let's see. All right. Oh, I see it. Okay. Choose share. There we go. Dream Song 4. This is from 1959. I think context matters. Filling her compact. Can everybody see that now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Filling her compact and delicious body with chicken paprika. She glanced at me twice. That first line is, and especially in 1959, I guess, almost pornographic. And then you turn the line and you realize, oh no, she's just eating. Yeah, but that's a mistake that isn't a mistake. The line here has a spectacular unit of meaning, because it tells you what's on, as it turns out, the character's name is Henry, what's on his mind. Fainting with interest, I hungered back, and only the fact of her husband and 4 other people kept me from springing on her or falling at her little feet and crying. As I say, that line break is extraordinarily functional, because it even though you read it as a sentence and then realize that, or you think you know where the sentence is going, you're fooled, but you're not fooled. You get the subconscious, or well, the very conscious desire of the speaker. So the first thing I would say to beginning poets is that line breaks really matter. They might not matter that much. That's a spectacular example of a meaningful sort of head twisting line break. But when you're reworking your poems, you may have said everything you want to say. You may have gone a sentencing perfectly. Your sentences may do everything you want. But the most important position on the line is the end of the line, especially in what we call free verse. Now, if you're writing blank verse, you have to end the line after 10 syllables. But even there, you can redo your syntax so that you get a spotlight on a word on the end of the line. For instance, Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening. The first line is inverted, oddly. It's a pretty straightforward poem. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. Well, most people would say, even back then, they would say, I think I know whose woods these are. But of course, then you lose your rhyme. And this poem is so musical that rhyme really matters. And even if you're not rhyming and you're writing, say, blank verse, you can still twist your syntax a little bit to put a spotlight on a word at the end. What I love about the rules of writing poetry and of the implicit rules in the poems that we read is that you can break them all. And they all need to be broken one time or another. The great thing about word processing is you can have 400 different drafts of the poem in your hard drive with 400 different line breaks. All the words the same, but different places to break the line. And then this is a black hole of revision that you could fall down. And this is one of the reasons I tell young poets, go ahead and publish the thing, because that'll make you stop revising it, or at least try to publish it. But after you publish it, you keep revising it anyway. It's endless. But that's the fun to me. Once I've got a poem verbally the way I want it, to go back and say, but wait a minute, maybe I can find something else in line breaks. Ultimately, what it amounts to for me anyway, is, does the poem look neat on the page or does it look ragged? There's a place for both of those. If you're writing about a ragged experience, you want the poem to look ragged. If you're writing about a neat and completed experience, you want the poem to look balanced and orderly and symmetrical. The problem with writing sonnets is that sometimes you want to break the line somewhere else. And I write lots of sonnets, but let me share one here that does a similar thing to what Tacey's did back there, where she buried the rhyme 2 syllables from the end of the line. That's what she was talking about earlier in that sonnet. Let me see. Yeah, I think this will work. Can you see that poem, Paris, New York, Philly?
Yes.
Okay. I started this as a sonnet, and in fact, it is a sonnet. But the more I worked on it, the more I realized that it needed to be a chunky poem that swallowed a sonnet, I guess is the right way to say it. I wanted functional line breaks, but I didn't necessarily want the rhymes on the end of the lines. And so in reworking this poem, I wanted the square shape because it's an ekphrastic poem in response to that square Brancusi statue that is so fascinating. And so I'll just read it. Paris, New York, Philly. The title refers to first the city where the sculpture was created, then where the sculpture traveled to, and where the sculpture has now ended up in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. There's a war going on. Brancusi chips at it yet again, number 4, this more simplified shape, this ultimate kiss for John Quinn, this not Rodin, no hip pressed by a man's hand trailing toward bliss. Lips locked, utterly equal, their eyes nearly fuse. They need no noses. They have breasts to press, heads flat and level to host a pair of martinis. Do not touch. And we do not. Still, we toast the smooth, the rough, the limestone baselessness of the artist's bus, this boot box essence. What is it we make tonight? We patronize the arts, we chat and share, we kiss the air. So if this poem was ragged looking, long line, short line, long line, short lines, it wouldn't feel like the right poem for this squared up statue. Now this can become a real gimmick, of course, okay, I got a minute or two here. You don't want to press the form and content, the visual form and the emotional content too much. It becomes, as I say, just a gimmick and an obvious thing to do. But you all know this poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, We Real Cool. Let me read it to you. This is one of my favorite examples of line breaks. Spectacular example also. I'm hiding it so you can't see it as I give it to you as an auditory experience. We Real Cool. Let's see. Make sure I got the pool player, 7 at the Golden Shovel. You're supposed to think in Chicago at this time, about 1960, that these are hoodlums, we used to say, gang members. And so it begins, we real cool, we real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. That's a notable poem in a number of ways. It's the only poem I know that is all stress syllables. It's also not visually written the way you expect it to be, because the word we is on the end of the line. Again, this is kind of a trick, meaning a gimmick, but I think it works beautifully. Notice it's 7 at the Golden Shovel. And if you look at the ends of the lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on the end of the line. And then at the end of the poem, there is no we. That's a line ending that is eloquently empty. We die soon and we see the space at the end. So I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate what you had to give to us there. Turning on to our third presenter, Lesley Wheeler, poetry editor of Shenandoah, is the author of 5 poetry collections, most recently, The State She's In. Her first novel, Unbecoming, was also published last year, and her essay collection, Poetry's Possible Worlds, will be out this fall. Her poems and essays appear in Kenyon Review, Eckertone, American Poetry Review, and elsewhere. Thank you for being here with us today, Lesley.
Thank you for having me.
As a writer and editor, what are some of the things that you've learned from editing that will help us in regard to lines?
I think that that was a big surprise for me of starting to teach Shenandoah is that to edit Shenandoah is how much the line breaks can make or break a poem. And so I want to talk about that. But first, I want to thank you, Stan and Morgan and Brittany, for putting this show on the road. This is really fun. And also to Tacey and Ron, whose words and ideas and perspectives I've loved listening to, and I'm going to refer back to, and also for the gift of their poems. So thanks to everybody, and thanks to everybody who's in the audience too. Oh, I also wanted to say that although we're meeting together in the ether, that I am speaking to you from Lexington, Virginia, which is also Monacan land. All right. So what I've learned about line breaks, I've learned from several sources. First of all, studying modern and contemporary poetry, which is characterized by a lot of experiment in terms of lineation. Certainly from teaching creative writing and trying to explain what I thought about line breaks to students, as well as seeing their experiments. Trying a million strategies myself has been important, but also that business of editing. When you edit a magazine that has a pretty high submission rate, like Shenandoah, I end up reading thousands of poems a year to choose maybe 30 to publish over 2 issues. And line breaks can really undermine a poem, or they can really boost a poem's power. And I'll talk in a few ways about how that happens. First off, I want to say, and this echoes Ron's point about poems being both for eye and ear, is that while lineation only happens in poems, not all poems use it. When a poem is read aloud in live performance or over a recording, you don't know where the line breaks are. You can certainly hear pauses, you can hear the breath, but line breaks are a visual phenomenon. You don't necessarily know what the tension is between the sentence and the line, as Tacey said, unless you can see how the poet has chosen to lay it out on the page. So they're visual, and even on the page, prose poems, of course, avoid them, but other kinds of poems in more experimental forms can avoid them too. And just to show you one of my own, can you see this one, the grid-shaped poem?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I saw a call for postcard-sized responses to the poetry of Mina Loy, and I thought I'd try something. And at the time, I was reading this really powerful book by Fatima Asghar called If They Come For Us. And she had this bingo card poem that I thought was amazing. So I tried it too. And it's, as you can see here, I wouldn't even try to read this poem aloud. I don't know where to start. I think that each square is in a sense a line, and yet that's not, their order is not prescribed, as in a bingo game, they could be determined in some random way. So I think that those kind of experimental modes can subvert the line the way a prose poem can. When poets do write in lines, as Ron and Tacey have said, and something that we share is that we're big fans of the sonnet, and I bet other received forms as well. So poets may make choices based on a fixed line length, and sometimes it's a metrical scheme, like that iambic pentameter line. Sometimes it's a syllabic scheme, or another kind of counted verse where you're counting words instead of syllables. An example I often teach is Sylvia Plath's Metaphors, where she's writing about pregnancy, and there are 9 lines that each have 9 syllables in them, and that's a clever little riddle poem to share with students. Whether there's a fixed length or not, however, contemporary poems written for the page tend to mix end-jammed and end-stopped lines. And sometimes, as Tacey said, to describe a rhyme or make it less, not describe a line, to hide a rhyme or to make it sound less loud to the reader. One goal there is to add layers of meaning. There's always this, the breath pauses at the ends of phrases or of sentences, but they're in tension with the visual pauses of line breaks. As Tacey also said, the visual line break can accent a double meaning. It can also create suspense in a way I find really interesting. It creates complexity because there's an additional meaning inside your sentences highlighted by that device. And complexity in poems, I think, is always worth going for. Line breaks also contribute to unpredictability and surprise. I know as a reader and a teacher, I crave poems that don't move the way that I expect them to. And I think that editors very much have this in common. That if you read so many poems, surprise becomes an incredibly welcome feeling. You really appreciate, surprise in content as well, but ideally content working with those formal choices in a way that's resonant. Editors also want to see resourcefulness. In most poems, lines should end in a variety of ways, showing that the poet has studied the possibilities and is thinking hard about making interesting choices that give layers of meaning to the poem. That's not always true. I've seen poems that really do a great job, for instance, or make a lot of sense of ending every line with a period. I just think that most times poets do that. It doesn't work. You have to be thinking about whether your material really justifies a more unusual choice like that. If you want to read more sonnets that use enjambment powerfully, I'm going to do as Ron did and suggest Gwendolyn Brooks. There's a sonnet sequence of hers called Gay Chaps at the Bar that I first read as an undergraduate. All the sonnets are fully rhymed, but they achieve a kind of syncopation as the poem Ron showed us does through different rhythms of lines and sentences. And it suddenly made me realize that I could experiment with form without sounding too pat, too predictable, in a way that I think has changed how I've written ever since. I went through the state she's in and found a free verse poem that's published in online, so I could show it to you easily. This one was published in a magazine that focuses on Southern writers called Story South. And I'm going to read it aloud to you and then talk about why I made certain choices the way that I did. And I think I disobeyed some of Hannah Huff's rules. I think I probably do so often. I really appreciated those tenets, but also I think whenever anybody throws a rule at me, I want to figure out a reason why it's justified to break it. All right. Spring Rage, and again, this is from my most recent book. It's called The State She's In. All afternoon and evening, wrath boils down the gutter pipe. In a sewerless town, it foams across yards trashed by dandelions and tiny violets, crashes past curbs, and maps a sloping path to creeks, polluted en route by exhaust, soap, the ash of striving. I am tin. I am flimsy and replaceable. But by the coursing of anger, I know I am not clogged with leaf duff or dead birds. I can carry a flow. I can talk about its cool, extraordinary passage. Hollow, but not nothing, a shape that directs torrents down and down. I want to say to the men who wrecked my life, fixed my life, and are now expecting gratitude, you cannot break or repair me. But they are busy in the clouds, banging thunderheads, directing water to fall, not understanding how it will scorn their plans and their power, displace who it wants, when it wants, numerously, even if today it seems invisibly biddable, whispering past us all. Just a couple of examples from this one. I was bringing together imagery of water and imagery of anger. And so I wanted the word boils to be accented because I wanted to suggest that sense both of water in motion and the heat of anger and draw attention to how that metaphor was working right from the beginning. A little further on, I think cannot is probably an odd word to end a line on, but what I was trying to do there was punch home the feeling of defiance that the poem is trying to express. And the second to last line where I use the word seems, what I was trying to do there was accent the gap between two realities. There's the reality where my bosses think they're in control, and there's the reality where I know that there are bigger forces than human power at work. All right. One last comment I want to make is about the one-word line. I often tell my students that they're really hard to pull off. They can seem kind of gimmicky. But I do think that there are exceptions. I often show students two versions of a beautiful poem by William Carlos Williams, who was one of those early and very influential masters of free verse line experiment. It's called The Locust Tree in Flower. So there are two versions. They're both long and skinny like a young tree. But one has very short lines with a few words per line, and the other pares it down to one-word lines. It makes less logical sense that way, and yet it remains really beautiful and evocative. And he achieves, through that structure, it's more like an impressionist painting, a long skinny one, I think, but it's also, it's just 13 words organized in 4 groups of 3 and then an extra, and it's a poem about spring, and that very tight structure gives you the sense of seasons in progress, this kind of circularity of time that the seasons create for us. So I would recommend that as one to look at if you're thinking about it. I'm going to show you just one more of mine, and I'll read it aloud, but it's super brief because it's only 14 words. So this was originally published in a little magazine called Unsplendid that I don't think it's live anymore, but it focused on weird approaches to poetic form, and I always enjoyed seeing what the poets in it did. I'm going to read this one aloud, but you'll notice I've changed one word in it to try to make the rhymes work a little better. It was originally called Past Meridian, and it's now called Occulted Sonnet. I didn't think it was necessarily obvious to readers that I was working with the sonnet form, but I wanted to highlight that, and also the sense of something hidden, as if the rest of each line is gone. You look, crook head awry to elude my gaze. Nobody sees me these days. All right. So, by way of example, that I'm not saying that I use the one-word line as brilliantly as William Carlos Williams, but I do think that for every rule, there's a worthy experiment in destruction of the rule, and I think it's really fun to try to find them. So thanks, everybody, and if we can have more open conversation, I'd love that.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the most challenging of the panels that we have put together, both in terms of the information that our presenters have brought to us, but also in terms of application, because every poet is going to pull different things from it, and it's a little bit like the five blind men and the elephant poem. We all get a hold of something different, and we say, well, this is what it is. And as Sherwood Anderson said, as long as we don't hold on to any one part too tightly, we keep from being grotesque about it. And so I just wonder, as we've talked about it several times, I mean, the sonnet became kind of the underlying organizational element that wasn't planned in here. And what I like about it is that it's like sonnet meets organic form, where the idea actually is more powerful than the received form of the sonnet, and how that we now have control. We're not controlled by the form, but use the form as a beginning point. And so, as we saw with the internal rhyme, as we saw with that last one that Lesley gave us with the occluded sonnet, where we're missing the entire line, so to speak, and yet those end words make sense for us. And I wonder if any one of our panelists might want to say a little bit more about how organic form informs the way that the poem finally ends up.
I have a sort of comment and a question that I'd love to hear answers from Tacey and Ron, is that I almost always know what form I want to experiment with, or whether I want to use free verse when I start a poem. I know writers who more often revise to form when they see the draft and it seems like close to something. And I wonder if you work the same way, because to me that's part of the organicness, is I see that like this material is really about obsession. So something with a lot of repetition, like a villanelle, might work really well for it, although I'm terrible at writing villanelles.
Yeah, this is something that I think about when I write, and part of my process. And I like to think that the poems themselves are waiting, right? They're waiting for me to listen. They're waiting for me to see them, and that they manifest themselves the way that they want to be born. And so sometimes when I feel like sometimes I have a sense of what they want to be. Other times I can feel like I'm kind of pushing up against the wall, like, okay, this is not the form that they want to be, even though I want it to be that form. So yeah, that's kind of my approach with a lot of my work.
Yeah, that's my approach too. I start a lot of sonnets. In fact, I do a full draft of of an Italian sonnet. Usually, I prefer Italian, but it almost always becomes a different form. It becomes sometimes a page-long, sort of scattered, crazy-looking poem with a sonnet, sort of a ghost of a sonnet in it somewhere. But usually, I've started very free forms that turned into blank verse. So I really don't know where it's going to go when I start.
And thank you. That's an excellent question, Lesley. And I'm reminded, for any of you listening, if you want to send in questions, this is the time to do it. But I think in terms of that question, it varies, from poet to poet. Typically, when I start a poem, I don't have a form in mind. My initial draft is to capture the ideas and the images, that I have that start the poem. And maybe because of that, most of my poems retain a free verse, kind of approach. But if I'm working on a poem and the suggestion of order or the suggestion of a sonnet or villanelle comes about, I typically will try a draft and say, does it go this direction? And again, maybe 1 in 10 will end up that direction, after I've tried it. If it doesn't look like it's working, then, I go to something else. This idea of organic form, though, is one that I think is at my core. I learned it from Denise Levertov, 40 years ago. And her claim that the poem has its form inherent in it as opposed to imposed upon it has been one that I have found the most helpful for me. I don't have to choose a form to start with. I let the poem and its content lead me to a form if it's going that direction.
I do try to impose a form and usually fail. Every now and then I think I can do this. This language is going to do what the hell I want it to, But when you get it, quote, finished, you realize it's not that good. There's something wrong with it. And so you change it.
I often say that I have a sonnet problem because I've written so many and the form has become so comfortable for me. I'll start going straight there. Like I'll start writing and it's like, oh, it's roughly iambic pentameter. And look, there's slant and rhymes down the end. And it's I think that sonnets are beautiful and I'm a huge fan of them, but they're also brief. And sometimes I don't want to, there's a part of me that's resisting really digging into something emotionally difficult in the material, and sonnets make that turn 8 lines in, and you so you're sort of move away from the problem almost as soon as you set it out. And some poems need to be longer and more complicated than that. So I kind of resist my sonneteeringness.
Lesley, I've discovered that I can do it. I'll do a sonnet and find, yes, it's left something out. And then I'll just say, oh, no, that's not a sonnet. That's a sonnet stanza. And I'll do another sonnet. So you can do a kind of a 2-sonnet, double sonnet. Of course, that could go on forever.
Does anyone else feel kind of, okay, so obviously I feel like my poems are kind of like my creations. And sometimes I feel preferential towards poems that are form and poems that are free verse, because the poems that come free verse, they, like I said, they manifest themselves as free verse. But I'm kind of like, oh, redheaded stepchild type. I don't know if anyone else feels that way, even though they're beautiful, I think, in their own way. I don't know. Any thoughts?
I do think about it a lot when I've got enough poems that I think, like, this is starting to be a collection. I start to think something there are great books of poetry that are all sonnets. 2 from the last few years, Terrence Hayes has a book called American Sonnets for My Once and Future Assassin that I think is astonishing. And there's a new one by Diane Seuss that's really good. But I think that like mostly books are not all one form. And I like having some variety in it. I like having verse that what Marilyn Taylor once said, that they're semi-formal, like like a party where you're bringing a lot of different forms together. And so, yeah, I find myself thinking about forms a lot, but I find myself favoring the ones that I've never tried before more than favoring, a specific form over others, maybe.
I hope to wake up one day and find that I can write villanelles by the yard, but I've only written one. I mean, I've started a lot of villanelles, but I've only written one that's kind of what would you call it? A cracked villanelle, a broken villanelle, which worked in the context because the speaker was an Italian who was trying to speak English. And so the villanelle didn't have to be a villanelle exactly, partly for that reason.
There's also the issue that when you're writing free verse, again, which I do a lot, you're a little bit more at sea. Sometimes it feels a little scarier that, could I be completely wrong? Are these supposed to be really long lines? Or was I supposed to, does the poem really want some kind of different strategy for line endings? And I just feel, the freedom is greater in some ways, but sometimes too much freedom is a little alarming.
I think that's true, Lesley, but it's also double-edged because I wonder how many sonnets, could have expressed themselves more clearly had they not been a sonnet. It goes both directions. And I think that's one of the beauties, as Ron alluded to earlier, the fact that you can do 400 drafts if you want to. Your computer will hold them all, and you can filter through them. You can look back. You can make decisions based on what you see or what you hear. Depending on which one you give priority to at the moment, if they're in conflict. And so the value of drafting, I think, is often overlooked, particularly by beginning poets who think their first draft, is the poem. No, the first draft, that's the child. But a lot of children have to grow up before you get, the beautiful, deep poems that they could be. I don't know too many, 4-year-olds that are philosophical. But a lot of poems are. We have. Let's go over to Brittany and see what she has in terms of questions for us.
All right. That was actually a really good segue to this first question. And they would like to know what is the particular attraction that this is open to all three of you, that you all particularly have to the sonnet form. We've spent a lot of time talking about sonnets. So they want to know what is really attractive to you guys about that specific form, or kind of deviating from that specific form.
I could say that something I love about all received forms is that they bring a level of complexity to them simply by the fact that in existing they refer back to everything else that's ever been tried in that form. And so I love that it helps me think about my relation to important poetic ancestors. But I also just think that that net of I'm very sound driven as a poet, and I think I fall into different kinds of rhymes sometimes accidentally, and I really love that way of creating an object that is as much for the ear as the eye.
I just kind of see, for me, the sonnet, there's so much allure for me, because it's got, the constraints. Of course, I feel like they're a little bit more than some other forms. And also, like, it's supposed to be pretty, and I like pretty things, but then I also write content that's not so pretty within a sonnet, to kind of break that convention. But I also love the length, and I love its brevity, and I love its the turn, right? I love the volta, and I love, it's just kind of like these like little bursts of like love. And I think that's kind of where I am right now in my life in these past few years. And so I'll probably move on to something next. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, that's for me.
What I love about the Italian sonnet is, it seems, the two-part structure, the question and answer, problem and solution, pain and soothing pain. It's kind of an automatic off-the-shelf form for that kind of intense focus. I guess partly I love sonnets because I love so many sonnets. I mean, so many sonnets in my head that I encountered and knew I would never forget as soon as I read them. The history of the sonnet, as you all were referring to too, because you're always working with the history one way or another. Your ideal reader knows that you read this sonnet by Milton. That's your ideal reader. And that you didn't like that third line of Milton's, and you're pushing back against it a little bit. I like doing what they did, but not.
I'll just add that I had a workshop teacher once who said that all good poems have turns and pivots. And I'm not sure she's right, actually, but I think it's a helpful thing to try. If you're somebody for whom iambic pentameter or rhyming just doesn't seem to work, because all of us have sort of areas that we're drawn to and areas that just don't work for us. An assignment I'll often give my students is I'll teach the sonnet, I'll teach a lot of examples, and then I'll say, if you feel like everything you're writing is coming out badly, just write me a 14-line poem that has a turn in it. And that in itself, that structure of argument in a sonnet is really really powerful.
I like that idea of the turn, especially the fact that just like if you write an essay, you have words, you have sentences, you have paragraphs. The turn can be at any level in the poem, and it might be that word boils at the end of line 1 that turns you into line 2, rather than something, some big break after line 8 that you see as the profound answer to the question. But I think that depending on how we define turns, I might say that, if it's a good poem, I'm pretty sure I'm going to find a turn in it someplace, because that's what we do as poets, is we're looking for connections, but we're not looking for just a single connection. We're always looking for that multiplicity of connections that puts us in a state of what if. And so again, going back to the word boils, which I thought ironic because I was just reading in Tacey's book, In Dishwater, and the line 1 ends with the word boils, and then goes on to dishwater on the next line. I thought, what is it about boiling that has to be at the end of line 1? But maybe that's our challenge. We all need to write a poem now that has the word boils at the end of line 1, and Tacey and Lesley have already given us examples for that. But I do think that sense of turning, that sense of complication that occurs, is what many of us are drawn to in a poem. Even something as simple as In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound has that turn in it, as we recognize the image that we started with is not the emotional image that we end with. And so I think that's our challenge. Let me go back. Brittany, do you have anything more for us to look at?
Yeah, I've actually got two more questions.
Okay.
The next one I'll ask, it's a kind of a second part to the very first question. But they wanted to know if there was any value or what additional value using a specific form would give to a poem. Obviously, we talked about sonnets, villanelles were mentioned, free form, anything like that, or what is the value that using a specific or sticking to a specific form would offer to a specific poem.
I think in some ways, we have addressed that kind of around the edges. And I'm going to go to organic form as our beginning point then to look at this, to say that the advantage is when the shape of the poem resonates with the content of the poem. That's the whole reason that we have these options, is to choose the right vessel, to present it in a way that reinforces what's being said rather than distracting from what is being said.
Yeah, I have a really bad metaphor that I've been thinking about since Lesley brought up, like, it's kind of this free flowing form, like with free verse. So I was thinking about, like, women, we wear Spanx sometimes, right? And so it gives us the shape and form that we want, right? That we desire, that for some reason we feel like we're more beautiful or we have more value, right? Because the word was value in the question. As opposed to like just wearing kind of like a summer dress where you just let it all hang out. Right? And it depends on, right, what is the value, right? Or what is what is valued? Is it that shape and form that you're looking for, or is it being natural and being yourself, right? Like, I think in a way, I haven't really quite thought completely through this metaphor. So Lesley and Ron, feel free to jump in if you want. But I was just thinking about that in terms of what is the value of form, and I think that it's what is your goal, right? What is the goal of the poem?
Yeah, if people wrote only in received forms, that would be boring, right? Like we need a lot of people experimenting in a lot of different shapes. And I just have to say, in response to your metaphor, Tacey, is that I have a favorite sonnet that's a very weird sonnet by Edna St. Vincent Millay, and it was one of the ones that she wrote later in her life, and it's called The Fitting, and it's about going in for a dress fitting. And I read it for a long time without realizing it was a sonnet, because the lines are so long that you can't see that it's 14 lines. It takes up 2 pages. But like, I think the value added quality to that being a sonnet is she's talking about trying to fit into a dress, and the lines demonstrate her exploding out of the sonnet's corset in a way that I just think makes the poem extra smart and funny when you understand what she's doing.
Yeah, I like Helen Vendler's distinction between external and internal form, or exterior and interior, I think is her phrasing. You can have 15 Italian sonnets with exactly the same rhyme scheme, let's say, but they're all different. One is a narrative and the other one isn't. One has a turn after line 3 and the other has a turn at the typical line 8, that sort of thing. One starts unhappy and becomes happy. The other uses metaphor and the other one doesn't. It's mainly abstract. So the value of using a receive form, an off-the-shelf form, say, like Italian sonnet, is to figure out what you're really trying to say. And that makes you say it somehow. Or if it doesn't, you throw that out and you go for the villanelle or whatever.
I think that what you're really trying to say is exactly what poets do. I think we spend more time laboring over a word or a punctuation mark or a white space than any other kind of writer. Simply because, in one sense, we're painters and writers, combined together, trying to figure out, what is the impact of this sound or this look on the page. So yeah, what are we trying to say? Okay, Brittany, you have our last question. We'll try to wrap it up here pretty soon.
Yes, and this one is aimed specifically for Tacey, but again, they say that Lesley or Ron, if they've got any additional comments, they can chime those in also. But this was to ask about how, Tacey, how your culture and your background influenced your writing and your work, if you wanted to talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, so I think, like any poet, our upbringing and our experiences all add into the work that we bring, right? Who our parents are, the language that we speak, that they speak, and our ontologies that we're taught, our cosmologies and cosmogonies and everything that make us who we are and where we come from. Yeah, so, I mean, being Diné and growing up in the Four Corners area in New Mexico and Arizona has really shaped not only who I am, but also my work. And, being a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is also part of my culture as a Christian. And I think that all of that goes into every piece of my writing, right? Because who I am culturally or physically, emotionally, spiritually, all of that goes into all of my work that I put into my poetry and into my work.
I can add that this is an odd detail for someone who grew up in suburban New Jersey, but I'm one generation away from a very strong oral tradition. That my mother grew up in the tenements of Liverpool in the 1940s, and her father was Irish. And so, it was a house without running water or electricity, and they memorized poems and told stories and sang. And even though that wasn't my childhood, my mother was still a big storyteller. My grandmother would come visit and tell us stories and teach me old songs that I have to say my kids have never been interested in learning. But I do think that especially what shapes us when we're young, even in ways that we don't recognize later, shape what our values are in whatever kind of work we do in the world.
Yeah, I think that's true of all artists. We grow out of our backgrounds, and it's there somewhere. What I do object to is the stereotyping of any person, gender, region, whatever, because there are people who say, well, you're this kind of person, therefore you can only write that kind of poem. Well, Shakespeare, let's go to Shakespeare. Shakespeare seemed to have been everybody at one time or another. He wasn't bounded by his white male background. He could become a woman quicker than some women could become women. If you look at his female characters, they're among the greatest female characters ever created. Shakespeare must have been a woman then. Well, he was. Imaginatively, he was whatever he needed to be. And I don't want any of us to be trapped out of our own imaginations, because every now and then you write a poem and people say, oh my God, that happened to you? And you say, no, I made it up. And they say, oh no, you couldn't have made that up. You must have done that horrible thing somewhere. Well, sort of, in my dreams maybe, or my worst fantasies.
This has been an exciting and thought-provoking panel, and I am grateful for everyone's participation, particularly Tacey and Ron and Lesley. Thank you for joining us today. Join us again for Pier-Glass Poetry Panels as we continue to develop them, and we'll see you next time.